Okay, we're at the beginning of Siman Tzadivov, and last time we spoke about a general overview about Davacharf, and today we're going to dive into Duchkah the Sakina, one of the main dinim that we learned from that has to do with Davacharf. Today will be the first of two Mirtashem parts about Duchkah the Sakina. So, when we spoke about Davacharf in general, we saw that the primary source from it is a Gemara that says that if you take something hard and you cut a hard Davacharf with a knife, then time transfers even if there's no heat. That we spoke about that Gemara Chulin, Kufid Alf and Beis, Kufid Beis and Alf, about Davacharf. And there, we only focused on the Davacharf parts of the Gemara over there. But really, the truth is that the Gemara says some other things also about things that are cut with a knife. And before I tell you what those are, first I have to just tell you that Rashi says that one of the reasons, we're going to talk about this later, which is one of the reasons for the Chumrah of Duchkah Sakina is that we assume that knives are not cleaned as well. And therefore we always have an amount of grease or food left on the knife. And that's that layer, that extra grease that's in that end that's in there is what's absorbed into the Davacharf when you cut a knife, when you cut something with a knife. Okay, so we'll talk about that more coming up. But for now, let's just keep in mind this idea that there's assumed that a knife has some grease on it, left over on it, and that has to do with the din of the Davacharf. Now, we'll talk later today, Mr. Shem, about whether that's true nowadays. Should we actually be concerned about that? But for now, we're going to work with the assumption, like the Gemara says, that, a knife is assumed to have been on it. So the Gemara says, now that we know this idea that the Gemara has a knife on, has a been, the Gemara says now a few different cases. We're going to be explaining the Gemara the way the Ran says it, the way the Shach brings it. Many bring this pshat. There's alternate explanation that the Ramah, the Teres Chatas, brings from Israel had a completely different pshat in this Gemara. But we're going to do it the way most people learn the way the Ran. And we're also not going to bring every case of the Gemara. The Gemara has a whole special din about Alephis and Selet, which we're not going to talk about. I mean, it's important to Shulchan, but that's not so relevant for us. And first, like this: if you take a fleshig knife and you cut lettuce, a turnip, or beets, okay, that's what we saw last time. You got a turnip. You could eat that with milchigs. They're not charav. And all you have to do is, but you do have to rinse off the place where you did the cutting. That is to say, there's no blia because it's not charav, but some of that grease that was on the knife does get stuck onto the edge of the turnips, and therefore we need to rinse them off. Okay, so the other place can say that the point here is that the lettuce, the turnips are hard, and when you cut them, they're very hard. They're hard enough that's considered Duchkah Sakina, and they're also so hard that when you cut something, the grease gets stuck on the outside of them, and therefore you need to do Hadachah. So the Aruch Shulchan says the same thing is for carrots. He has another thing which is a bruska, which he always puts together with carrots and turnips. I'm not sure what it means. I'm wondering if it maybe means rutabaga. But anyhow, so carrots, because it's also hard. And we could add some other things that are hard like that. Also, I'm saying all these things that are hard in contrast to some soft things I'm going to say in a second. But I could add some other hard things, or other vegetables that are hard, and that are not charav, kohlrabi and parsnips, and potatoes or sweet potatoes. When I meant those two that are when they're raw, and the stalk part of a broccoli or cauliflower. Okay, so that's one group of things. The Gemara says if you cut a lettuce with a knife, and then the Gemara says, what happens if you cut kishas, or cucumbers, so last time it's cucumbers, and you cut that with a knife? Then you could eat that with milchigs. You could eat it with milchigs. Again, it's not harf again. You could eat it with milchigs. But you have to scrape off on some of the area where the knife cut. You have to do gerairah. You have to scrape off, like shave down a little bit at that area. Now, cucumbers also not harf, and they don't absorb any of the end. They don't absorb any of them, but there's some get stuck on the outside of it. But you can't do hadachah because we'll say the word is because they're soft. Okay, the word that the Ran uses is, he says shemitoch lachusam. There's a softness, or we'd say maybe a sponginess or a moistness, something. I'm not sure the great word to translate the word lachusam. I'll use the word soft. Since they're soft, what will happen is if you rinse them, that might push some of the grease from the knife that got stuck onto them, might push it into cucumber, so you're sort of defeating the purpose. So you need to do gerairah, shave off or scrape off a layer in order to make sure you've gotten all the be'en off of there. So both of these things, the hard double charf or the soft double charf that need hadachah or gerairah, the hard not charf or the soft not charf that need hadachah or gerairah, this is not a double charf. There's no blia getting into this thing. But we need to do something to get rid of the be'en, because the be'en on the knife is there, even though it's not charf, it's still there anyhow. So later the person can give other examples that have to do that have the same that applies, and that you have to do gerairah for. I'll mention a few of them. The ones that I know of. I'll mention the ones that I know of. One is bread. Okay, it's also, again, if you think about it, it's like, I don't know if the word porous is exactly right, but things get stuck into them. The Rambam says watermelon. Shulchan says cabbage. Now, the cabbage is a little bit of an interesting one. When he says cabbage is not soft. It's not porous or anything like that. So I'm thinking that what he means is when he says cabbage, he means that if you take a head of cabbage and you slice across it, so it's got a million folds, all the layers of the cabbage. So the problem is that the grease will go into the folds. So the cabbage per se, each leaf of cabbage is not soft. There's nothing soft about that at all. But the places where there's where food gets trapped between the layers. Okay, and that for our purposes that's just as good. And for that, that's cabbage. And then the Aruch also says pumpkins, kirbis, pumpkins. Now, pumpkins, again, the flesh, the pulp of the pumpkin also doesn't seem to me to be soft. At least when I tried it out, it didn't seem to me like that soft. And then there's the inside of the pumpkin, the center of the pumpkin, the fibrous strands that are in the middle are, of course, those are soft and spongy for sure, and they absorb. But at least nowadays, nobody eats that part. So I was thinking that maybe what he means is it's the soft area that's between the pulp and these fibrous strands. It's like there's like a place where they meet each other, so to speak. And that part of the taco would qualify. I hear that as being a soft, unless he meant cooked pumpkin. Everything else is raw. So unless he meant cooked, I'm guessing he means that area where the pulp, the thick part of the main part that you eat of the pumpkin comes and meets the fibrous strands. Maybe that's what he's talking about this so far. Okay. Now there's some other cases, meat and fish and cheese. We'll talk about in a minute. We'll get those in a second. Other cases that might go this. Yeah. So those are cases that the poskim that I know of mention as being soft foods. So then I had the other ones that I thought might also qualify also, and those include avocado. I'm going to say in alphabetical order: avocado and broccoli or cauliflower florets. And those I thought of as being exactly the same as the cabbage that I said before. About the Aruch Shulchan says that cabbage. It's not the cabbage per se. The way I understood it, it's the layers between them. So florets of broccoli or cauliflower are same thing. It's got a million little holes where the grease could get stuck into them. So we'd have to do gerairah. Talk about grapes and hearts of palm. That means from a can. Kiwi, lettuce, which is like cabbage. Mangoes, all kinds of melons, orange, tomatoes, and if you had cooked potatoes or sweet potatoes. So those are other foods where they're hard enough to need to have duchkah the sakina, but they are soft enough that we'd say hadachah is not going to work, and a person's going to have to do gerairah in order to get the end off from the point where the cutting was done. Now, the Gemara, when it talked about when you put a double charf, let's go back for a second to double charf. There, the Gemara doesn't say how deep the tongue goes in. It just says this: you can't eat it with milk. It doesn't say how much tongue goes in. It's not like Hadachah and gerairah that it's a little more clear what you have to do. So is Machlokas Rishonim how deep it goes in. The Mechaber says it goes in Kadei Netila. Kadei Netila is approximately an inch. And the Ramah says that you should be machmir for the sheet that says it goes Kadei Kuloi, that when you cut it, the tongue goes all the way through to the radish or the onion or something like that, as if they were hot. Okay, it's a Machlokas. The Ramah says we should be machmir l'chatchila to say it goes Kadei Kuloi. Now, after you heard all that I've read so far from this Gemara in Chulin, on Kufid Aleph and Kufid Beis, if we had to think of where to put meat and fish and cheese, or at least most cheese. When I say cheese, I'm talking about like mozzarella cheese or cheddar cheese, a hard cheese. But lafuke, soft cheeses, that are very soft, and those are not duchah sakina at all. Like cottage cheese, there's no duchah sakina, and on the other hand, like the Parmesan cheese, that is so hard that there's no softness in them at all. There's no need for gerairah at all. But regular, we'll call like an American, I don't know, American cheese, not a good example, of cheddar cheese or mozzarella cheese, and meat and fish. So we would think, and we'll see the person say the same thing. We would think that they should qualify as soft. Okay, which is to say is if you cut a piece of meat with a non-kosher knife, or I guess with a nuchuk knife, or a piece of fish, then you have to get, it's not charif, you have to get the be'en off. You have to get the be'en off at the point of contact. You can't do hadachah because it has a softness which will absorb the grease. So instead, you would think you should have to gerairah. That's what people think you'd have to do. The problem is, or the question is, that the Gemara in Chulin on Daf Ches, that's way back at the beginning of Chulin, says you can do hadachah. Okay, we'll see more about this Gemara in a second, but the Gemara says is that if you cut a piece of meat and it's a straight knife and it's cold, then essentially the Gemara, according to Shita, that says it's cold, assuming it's cold, then you just do hadachah. So what's going on here? I've just been telling you that the Gemara says on a few days that if you have something soft, cut with a knife that's fleshig or not kosher, same thing, then you have to do gerairah because it's soft, and you have to worry about the grease that got sort of absorbed in. So I think that the answer is that totally independent of this, nothing to do with our questions, but having to do within that sugya itself, the Rashba says, we spoke about this when we learned about shchita, the Rashba says is that the word, when that Gemara says hadachah, it doesn't mean rinsing off. He has a raya from within the sugya, it's not relevant to us. The hadachah does not mean rinsing off. As an aside, presumably to understand why did the Gemara use that funny word hadachah if it didn't mean it. It meant hadachah because it's a machlokes in the Gemara there, what you have to do. One sheet that says hadachah and one sheet that says klipah. So hadachah is just saying you don't need to go as dramatic as klipah, you can get away with hadachah. So that it's just, hadachah means to say some kind of rinsing. But it doesn't mean hadachah like an arkamar. It doesn't mean a simple rinsing. And the Rajah says what it means there is, it means shifshuf godol biyadayim heitev. You need to have vigorous scrubbing with your hands, together with your hands rubbing along it also. Okay, so it's much more serious than a plain hadachah. And we could say, seemingly, that when we worry about that grease gets absorbed, sort of soaks into the meat, or the fish, or the thing that's soft, you could do that. One way to take care of that problem is through gerairah, but you can also do this intense scrubbing, this vigorous scrubbing, and that will also do the same trick. Okay, now we could see something like this in the Hadachah, who says he says that fish and meat, actually, they're too soft to do gerairah, which is to say meaning that they obviously they're not soft, totally soft, like I said, like cottage cheese. If they are, otherwise it wouldn't be duchah sakina at all. So they're hard enough that it's duchah sakina, but they're too soft for gerairah. You can't scrape off a layer. He says, kivakusam ieshalem legara, or okay, but he's saying that about meat and fish, two different things. So they're obviously the duchah sakina, but they're hard, but they're not hard enough that they could actually be scraped. So what are you going to do now? You can't do gerairah. You can't, hadachah is not enough, and you can't do gerairah because gerairah physically is not possible to do. So what should you do? So he says the right thing to do would be to take over klipah, which is a layer that's thick enough. Klipah, we're going to talk about klipah in a second. Klipah is thick enough that you could hold the whole layer in your hands. It could like hold itself together, and you'll be able to hold it in your hands. He says that's what you should really do, because you need gerairah, you can't do gerairah, so you would have to do klipah. He says, but sometimes a fish is so oily that in order to get a piece that would hold together, the oily part is not going to hold together, so you would basically be cutting off the whole fish. It wouldn't be work. That's an important part of the Hadachah that's interesting with it. When the Pesach Tshuva brings this Hadachah, he doesn't bring that part of the question. But the Hadachah makes it clear that that's the reason why, that the reason this fish was mufla b'shamnunas, it was so fatty that there was no way to get off a kadeh. He says if you cut off a kadeh klipah, you'd have nothing left to the fish. To get a kadeh, you could hold it in your hands. So he says, so since you really need to do gerairah. You can't do gerairah because the fish is too soft, and you can't do kadeh klipah because it's not going. You lose your whole fish. So he says, what you should do is you should do a really good scrubbing. And he says words that echo. He doesn't bring the Rajah, but it sounds almost like the Rajah. He says okay, so it sure sounds like very much like the Rajah using the same word to be meshafshif and to do it really well. And it's not very much like the Rashba. So that's what he thinks you should do. And then he says, he asks actually from the Ran, but anyway, then he says that if you want to be even better, what you should do is, instead of just doing this big shifshuf, what you should do is you should rinse it off with water. But to solve the Ran's problem, which is that it'll help palm actually get absorb too much, what you should do is you should rub a knife, push a knife blade sideways across the meat while you're doing this, so to dislodge anything, to dislodge and flush out any grease that's there. So while the water's running over it, you're running the side of a blade of a knife along the meat. So what will happen is any grease that came off the knife, that came off the original knife, the treif knife, that's now in the meat, instead of getting pushed further in, will get loosened and will get flushed out with the water. Okay, so this question. So we've seen here that you should do, if it's not possible to do gerairah, you have something soft enough that you can't do hadachah, you have to do gerairah. So you should really do klipah. That's our first choice. Otherwise, this shifshuf gadol, or the Hadachah, or this other idea, the Hadachah says that maybe you rinse the meat and fish and you scrape with the side of the knife as another way to avoid this. Okay, all those are ways, because this is something that's hard and soft, to someplace in the middle there. Okay, now this issue of what do you do with a piece of fish that was cut with a non-kosher knife is very negative to someone who buys kosher fish in a non-kosher fish store. Rich Hashem, that will be, I don't think we can do it today, I think that's going to be next time. Okay, what to do with that? Okay, so now we're not finished yet. So we so far mentioned the Gemaras that talked about doing Hadachah, Gemara about doing gerairah, the Gemara about for a Davachar that you have, it's Kedei Kulai or Kedei Tila. Then we saw here in the Hadachah, together sort of with the Rashba, that for things that are like sort of in between, in these special cases of meat and fish, and maybe cheese, we need to do shifshuf gadol. Okay, now, this Gemara that I mentioned beforehand on Daf Ches, that talked about cutting meat with a knife, is going to teach us some other things also. Okay, now, what's going on in that Gemara is, the Gemara talks about a person that shchita with a knife, with a non-kosher knife, a goy's knife, and that's a machlokes, whether whether, as I mentioned, whether you have to take off kedei klipah or you do hadachah. And the Gemara has different pshatim as to what the machlokes is. Like one pshat is the base of shchita hard or not? One has different things. And the machaber is mekel. He says that the ikar din is you could be mekel and call what we do hadachah or the shifshuf gadol. But the Mechaber says it's better to be machmir, and the Ramah says that the Ikar didn't like to be machmir. But what's going to come out is that from the discussion of the Gemara, we're going to get some other cases that both need to be, that you have to go for kedei klipah, okay, which is more than anything, well, not everything, but almost everything we said until now, except for the case of Davacharav, nothing needed kedei. Anything kedei klipah is going to be more than anything our Gemara had said before. Okay, so two cases that come out of the Gemara. Now, there are other cases all over Shulchan Aruch talks about where you need kedei klipah, nothing to do with cutting with knives, like the gavar, or malicha, or certain kavash, or irreklivation, a bunch of different cases that there's a din with Blios kedei klipah. But for cutting with knives, we're going to pull out two more cases from this Shulchan Aruch brings. These two more cases that come out of this Gemara. And one is like this: if a person would take a treif knife, or a milchig knife, and within 24 hours of that milchig knife being used for hot milchigs, he cut a hot piece of meat. So then the bli is kedei kulai. That's simple. Okay, the bli goes all the way through. Fine. What happens if he cut the meat when the knife was ein ben yarmin? It had been used for milchigs, and more than 24 hours later, he cut a piece of meat. So none of the bli is going to cause a problem for the meat because it's ein ben yarmin. Once it's ein ben yarmin, no problems with blios. But what we still have to worry about is what we've been talking about this whole time is that there's the end on the knife. Knives are assumed to be dirty. If the knife is dirty, we have to get that end off. So here the din is you have to take off a kedei klipah. That is to say, the meat is not charif, but since since the meat is hot, therefore the end that was on the knife gets absorbed kedei tila. Okay, and as I said before, it's absorbed kedei klipah. Okay, kedei klipah. which is to say is you have to take off a layer that's thick enough that you could, if you pull it off, it would come up, it would hold together in one piece. Okay, that's how I have to explain. It's more than gerairah. Okay, it's more than we said to about gerairah. Okay, so since the meat is hot, so it's not charav. But since the meat is hot, the grease that was on the edge of the knife gets absorbed a little further in, and it goes into the klipah. Okay, now, that's one case with the Gemara. Okay, before I go on to the Gemara, why, if I told you if it's hot and there's grease on there, why does it go in kedei kulei? What happened there? Why is it going to make klipah anyhow? The Taz brings two tzutzim, just as a sort of an aside, the Taz brings two tzutzim, either because there's so little grease on the knife that doesn't go very far. Theoretically it can go kedei kulei, but there's just so little, that's what the Bach says, the Taz brings from the Bach, that there's so little that doesn't go through, or the other choice is that it actually does go through. The Taz says his own answer. It really does go through, but the amount that goes through is so little that it's Bitul b'shishim. Okay, a variation of what the Bach said. But on the edge, on the kedei klipah, there's a thicker concentration, and that there it's not Bitul b'shishim, so you have to take out the kedei klipah. Okay, the other thing is, the Ramah says another case where you have to take out kedei klipah is what happens if you cut meat that was hot, but it was only in a klisheni, then. So usually we'd say no tam can transfer into klisheni, but since it's Duchkah together with klisheni, that's enough to make a tam transfer to klipah. And I want to point out that this is assuming that you don't hold a double, that there's no special chumrah of a double gush, which is what the Rambam sheet. Okay, so we've heard, I said, a whole bunch of different ways of how much bleed could be absorbed. I'm sorry, how much bleed, what you have to do to get rid of the bleed that's be'en on the knife. The be'en that's from the knife, they get onto the food when it's not charav. If it's charav, you maybe have to take kedei kulei or kedei netila. But if it's not charav, if it's a hard thing that was not charav, you do hadachah. If it was a soft thing that was not charav, then you have to do gerairah. If it's a soft thing that's not charav, that you need to do gerairah, but you physically can't do gerairah, then we do shifshuf, or we think with the knife. And if it's not charav, and the soft is not the issue, but the problem is that it was hot, then you potentially, and there's no shakal of Blios because it's ain't ben. Then what you have to do is you have to take kedei netila. You have to take off kedei klipah. Now, the whole time we've been talking about this concern that there's be'en left on the knife. The way Rashi says that this is Rashi's second shot, that there's be'en left on the knife. He says pa'amim shahasham nunus karashalav ve'einu nikar. That there's times that the grease is like caked onto the blade, but you can't notice it very easily. And that's why we were concerned that transfers from the knife onto the food that you cut. Okay, and the truth is, there's a Gemara, another Gemara, nothing to do with our kind of cases, that says that there's enough grease left on the edge of a knife that you could cut it off and make an erev tafshit with it. That's so much left on the edge of the knife that there's not something you could actually hold in your hand and make an erev tafshit on it. Okay, so everybody else, lots of other people explain this Rashi. The Shach says it in Siman Yud, but lots of people say this, that usually we assume that kalim, pots and pans and dishes and all kinds of things like that are clean and there's no be'en left in them. We make an assumption, unless we know otherwise, we assume kalim are clean. But knives are different, and we assume a knife is not clean. Okay, so therefore, even if a knife is ain't ben, so there's no problems of bleeds coming out because ain't ben, but if we use a knife to cut the food, we assume some of the grease that was left on the knife, some of the stuff left stuck onto the knife, some of that transferred onto the food, and now we have to get rid of it through our Hadachah or gerairah, etc., all those kinds of things like that. Okay, now, the simple understanding is that the problem is, like I just said, that people don't clean their knives very well. If you don't clean your knife, then there's going to be be'en left on it. So if that was the whole thing, then the Gemara, if you wanted to tell a person what should he do to use his knife that was used for treif or fleshing, what should he do? So you would say the person should do is he should clean it. If the problem is that people just don't clean their knives, they just use them and they don't clean them between uses, then what should you say to fix the problem? How do you use a knife that was used beforehand for something that was not kosher? The answer would be you should clean it. But that's not what the Gemara says. The Gemara at the end of the Zohar says that if you want to make your knife that was used for treif fit to be used for kosher, it says you have to do ne'itza. Ne'itza means you stick it into the ground. You take ground that's a little hard and a little soft, and you poke it into the ground 10 times, and it's dirt that's pretty hard but not too soft, not too hard. And the idea here is, what's going on here with this neitza thing? What is that? The answer is that the way that the end got stuck onto the knife because you cut a hard thing. So cutting hard things causes things to get stuck onto a knife that don't get, not in the way that get stuck onto a plate. So it's not just that you don't clean the knife when it gets dirty. It's that things get stuck on much harder than they would to something else. And the only way to, and a regular cleaning is not going to get it off. So it's not just a matter that you don't clean it. It's that what you do to clean is not going to do the trick. It's not going to be good enough to get it clean. The cleaning that you do won't do the trick. So what you have to do is you have to do something, scrape the knife with something abrasive, something hard, in order to get just like the end got caked on by cutting. So you have to sort of do the same thing, push it into the hard sand as a way of, so to speak, cutting again with something that will scrape off the end on the knife. So it's not just that we don't clean our knives. It's that even if we would clean our knife, it wouldn't do the trick. Cleaning the knife is only half the problem. The knife is not clean, not just because we didn't clean it. It's not clean because the cleaning we would do won't do the trick. And the end is so caked on, it's karash alav, like Rashi says, the shalminus is karash alav in a way that our cleaning is not going to do the trick, and we need this extra special cleaning called neitza, which we spoke about when we learned Hagol's Kalim, exactly how to do it. But the point is, it's not a regular cleaning. You have to do something more than that. Okay, now, the Gemara doesn't say pasuk. This doesn't, Kagola and Libun are based on psukim. The din of the idea of neitza doesn't come from a pasuk. It's a practical thing. Okay, it's a practical thing, or something logical that that in order to get off the end that got caked on because you cut through something hard, you have to run it through this abrasive, stick it into the abrasive 10 times, and that'll get it clean. So a lot of people assume that you can find other eitzes that do the same idea. For example, if you have in a cheese factory, so the cheese is produced in blocks, and you want to slice it into slices that people could use at home. So they don't slice it with a knife, but with a traditional knife. What they do is they have cheese wires. These thin wires that are very taut. And you push the cheese through the wire, and that cuts. The wires are stationary, and you force the cheese through the wire, and that cuts the cheese into the slices that you want to make. Okay, so the wires are essentially functioning like knives. They have Duchkah. They push through the cheese to make the slices. But it's impossible, physically impossible to do neitza. Then you can't stick a wire into the ground, thrust it into the ground like a knife. It's not possible. So what you do is you clean them with steel wool, and the idea is it's a reverse neitza. Instead of pushing the knife into the abrasive soil, instead you scrub the abrasive. In this case, it's the steel wool. Abrasive against the knife. You get the same idea. Instead of the Gemara sticking the knife into the soil, you stick the soil into the knife. Okay, so for a knife, it's easier to do it by neitz into the ground. For these wires, it's easier to do it with the steel wool against the wires to get all of the end off of them. And similarly, Feynman said to me that if you wash it with soap and water and a sponge, that's not abrasive. The point here is not the soap and water don't work because they're abrasive. The point is not that the sponge is abrasive. The point is that soap works in its own way. It gets rid of the end, gets rid of grease. So the point is if we can get rid of the end that got caked on, we have a way to regular, just like rinsing it off in the sink is not going to do the trick. On a plate, that might work. Use a little, just a sponge or a shmata and clean up a plate. That might do the trick. But for a knife, it's not going to do it. The stuff it's baked on too strong. So you have to do something more. So we do neitza, we could do steel wool, or we could do soap and water. Okay, but there is a shayla in the Paiskim that what happens if somebody clean the knife with water and a sponge, okay? Not soap, not steel wool, and in his mind, he thinks it's clean, okay? He didn't just do the regular clean like anybody else does. He did, to him, it sure seems like it's clean, okay? So some of the Achronim say, I'll tell you names in a second, some of them say is that's good enough. Especially b'diavad, that's good enough. I mean, those who say b'diavad will say the Gemara's in the neitza is just a lechatchila. You should do neitza, but if you think that you got to clean, and even if you didn't do neitza or any substitute, that's good enough. And they'll understand that the Gemara is about Duchkah Sakina, all these Gemaras are talking about at the end, it's talking about if you didn't do a special cleaning, you just did the regular everyday cleaning, you didn't do anything special, then you assume that there's Be'en on it. But if you cleaned it special and you know it was clean, then they hold that it's okay. For example, the Ramah in Teres Chata says that if a knife is clean enough that the water, if you put water onto it, it just flows off, then that's a sign that it's clean. As in contrast to a knife that's not so well cleaned, the water will bead together. If you want to know the science of why it beads together, it's supposedly because the water is polar, that attracts the water attracts to itself. Usually, it would also, that's called adhesion. That's called cohesion. And if there's nothing on the knife, then it has cohesion it has adhesion to the blade, and it rolls off. Those forces work against each other. When there's grease on the blade, and that makes it to be non-polar, then the beads just attach to each other and they don't roll off. Okay, whether the science is right or not, I'm not sure, but that's what I think. Well, that's what I understand. So, so the point is, the Ramah says that if the water beads together and doesn't flow off so smoothly, then you know that there's still Be'en on there. But if you got to clean well enough that the water flows right off, if it flows right off very smoothly, then you got to clean, and you don't have to worry about this issue of Be'en anymore. Some of the Achronim, the Hadachah and the Yaakov there, which Rabbi Krieger brings in Shulchan Aruch, and the Yehuda, say, one of the days in the Yehuda, one of the days in Rabbi Krieger, say that it's okay to di'evet. If you did that kind of cleaning, it's okay to di'evet, but l'chatchila, what the Gemara says that you have to do ne'itzah, and the Shulchan Aruch brings that you have to do ne'itzah, that means l'chatchila you must do ne'itzah, but di'evet, if you knew that you got to clean, that would be good enough. And Krieger then brings, but that Tfu Shor says, that's not true, and that even the evidence no good. The only way that you can get the knife clean is to do ne'itzah, or one of the other things we mentioned. He would probably agree that you could do the soap and the steel wool. The point is just a cleaning, that you just think that I did a cleaning and I did it good enough without any special instrument or tool or method. I just did my, so to speak, regular cleaning, or I just did a little bit better. That would not be good enough. Okay, all this, as you can imagine, we can have practical applications, and those applications will, Mitzvah Hashem, be for next time.